when everyone cumulatively overruns, and we run out of questions. So thank you very much indeed for that. So Lisa, if we can ask you to run on, that will give us some time for questions at the end. But I mean, I think it's been very good to have a range of views and institutions. Lisa.
Thank you. Yes, Lisa Elges from Transparency International. As you may know, Transparency International is an international civil society organization. We're a global movement of about 100 partners in 100 countries across the globe. We are working to tackle corruption through positive and constructive ways to promote transparency, accountability, and integrity. And it's on this basis that we're looking at climate governance and climate financing, where our objective is pretty clear. We want to promote better transparency, accountability, and integrity to ensure that a good deal of the climate financing gets to where it needs to be going and a good deal of results can be achieved. And we do this primarily through research, capacity building, advocacy, and networking. And I think in the room we can already see possibilities for much more networking along the lines of our work as well. 2 weeks ago, actually 11 days ago, we published our global corruption report this year featuring on climate change. The purpose of this book was to scope out what are the particular governance weaknesses and strengths within the current climate governance, climate finance architecture as it is today, and to build on lessons learned and experience from the past to try to give a sense of what kind of risks might exist in terms of lack of transparency, possibilities of corruption, and so on, which can be useful information in terms of designing a new climate finance architecture. Transparency International does not investigate individual cases of corruption, so this is not a report on corruption per se. It is a scoping of governance challenges for climate change. And today I will be addressing particularly those challenges, some of the issues discussed in the book regarding adaptation finance. This slide are the numbers that you're all very much familiar with, but basically the premise of looking at the climate finance and governance issues from TI, which is not an environmental NGO, but was really to look primarily at the money, the amount of money that is being spent and anticipated to be spent in terms of pledges, and then also the amount of finance that's actually needed outside of the 100 billion long-term financing that we're looking at. Actual needs have been assessed between 300 and 400 billion annually starting yesterday, and we're looking at a great deal of volume of money being channeled through various new instruments and untested systems where there could be a vulnerability of governance weaknesses. Our report looks at the governance challenges on both sides of the coin, really. It's just to say that governance challenges exist in both developed countries and developing countries. And some of the issues that are scoped out in the book and the report is, as you well know, whether or not the climate financing will be new and additional, particularly for adaptation finance, what kind of agreement will be reached on monitoring and measuring, reporting and verification, what these guidelines will be, how we can ensure integrity in this process, and the kind of guidelines that are equitable in nature that benefit both developed and developing countries. A lot of the adaptation finance governance challenges look at recipient countries and their capacities to absorb large volumes of climate finance and also to ensure that processes are country-driven. It's fairly clear that corruption is affecting countries across the globe, and this map illustrates Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, which gives a view of how much corruption is perceived, indicating weak governance in a number of countries across the globe. The darker the color gets in red indicates the more severity of how corruption is perceived in these countries. And perception is a key word here. Corruption, as you know, is a covert activity. So measuring corruption is, in fact, very difficult to do, and this indicates perceptions. most climate impacted countries, most countries which are very vulnerable to climate change, also are vulnerable to weak governance systems. And this is a challenge that needs to be addressed. In terms of messaging, and an important point that I think Transparency International wants to convey, and I think this is a good juncture to communicate that, is not that climate finance should not be spent. Climate finance needs to be spent. Climate money is needed to address the pressing needs for climate change adaptation and mitigation across the globe. It must also take account of the fact that there are governance challenges and weaknesses, and building the capacity of countries and building mechanisms that have very good accountability and transparency mechanisms is equally important in this process, to convey this quite clearly. One of the sectors which affects adaptation, or that we would be looking at in a very practical way on adaptation projects, if you will be infrastructural developments, construction, developing projects to support flood prevention systems, drought, to deal with drought, to deal with sea level rise, and so on. Our Bribe Payers Index indicates that, and the Bribe Payers Index is based on surveys of top corporations in developed and developing countries. The view of corporate leaders in the sector was that the public works and contracting sector is actually one of the most corrupt. World Bank and other analysts also agreed to this point. So we're dealing with a sector where a large amount of money will be invested that is highly prone or vulnerable to corruption. And this also needs to be borne in mind. Our report does do quite a bit to analyze what some of the problems, or where corruption can seep into the construction sector through the procurement process, and what kind of impacts that this might have over the long term. The World Bank estimates that between 5 and 20% of the project price is lost or to corruption, indicating that there is often an increase in the price for a project, and also a decrease in the quality of what is delivered. The report also looks at, I'm just going to go quickly here to one case study, and for example, as you know, hurricane in a developed country, let's take the United States, when Hurricane Katrina hit, it caused a great deal of damage to the area and to the people. But one of the problems, and it's discussed in the report, was that the seawall defenses were poorly constructed due to lack or negligence on the part of the local government. Had those defenses been built properly, it would have saved the state $71 billion US. So we're looking at cost, value, and impacts of how good governance can actually increase the quality and the longer term cost involved in projects. The water sector as well, just going back to this slide, the report looks at, for example, how many people will be exposed to water stress caused by climate change by 2020, and that the stress will be amplified by the fact that there are weak governance, regulatory frameworks, and law enforcement in many countries. There's one analysis that says that water sanitation, to achieve the UN Millennium Development Goal on water and sanitation, will actually cost 48 million additional US dollars due to problems with complex bureaucracy and corruption in countries. There's a very interesting case study on Bangladesh as well, which also gives a best practice in terms of how a water program is being developed in Bangladesh, which involves civil society consultation, a great deal of transparency and accountability, which is meant to prevent against corruption, but ensure the quality and the best value for money project in developing a water supply improvement project in Bangladesh. In humanitarian relief, the book looks at this issue as well. Emergency aid with extreme weather events caused by climate change and so on we will see a great deal of increase in financing for emergency aid over the next years. It's expected to raise considerably the amount of climate financing required to deal with extreme weather events, not just the prevention, but this is dealing with the impacts of those events insofar as prevention measures have not been taken. So, and there are and have been many cases documented or examples of how not always the money has got to the beneficiaries or the victims of typhoons, hurricanes, and earthquakes, and so on. Another issue covered in the book, which is another adaptation issue, if you will, is an issue called climate migration, where countries impacted by climate change will see large numbers of people being internally displaced or having to migrate across borders, where here again we have a very weak global governance structure, but also national governance weaknesses that need to be redressed, and there's a lot of work being done to propose different strategies and different financing mechanisms to support people who are displaced because of climate change. And there are other cases in the book which are looking at a combination of adaptation mitigation overlaps, looking at, for example, the case of Bolivia, which is one of the world's main resources for lithium, and potentially could bring a great deal of revenue into the country from the export of this commodity. Will this become a resource curse? Can the revenues that are created from this new, let's say, climate resource, mitigation, environmentally friendly resource, actually be generated back into the country to help support development policies and social development? This is equally the same types of issues are raised with regard to biofuels project and so on, where we've seen impacts on local populations and problems of land grab and land rights issues that have also been raised as well. There are also issues with, and I won't go into this, but there's the quite a number of development adaptation issues that are relevant with REDD+ and forest concerns as well. Transparency International has developed a number of tools, particularly to address some of the areas. So we're looking at kinds of best practices and partners to see how we can create constructive ways to deal with the governance difficulties or challenges that we are faced. We have, and this is another discussion to be had, but, and I'm happy to provide more information about these particular tools, but they basically try to increase integrity and anti-corruption safeguards in procurement processes in the construction sector, the water sector, and we have a number of analytical tools that are looking at risk mapping in forest and climate governance sectors as well. So, in conclusion, with a great deal of complexity in climate financing and a great deal of money that is going to be involved, and many questions about integrity of how systems or mechanisms are going to be operated, both on developed countryside and developing countryside, and with a risk or a potential that some of that money may not get to where it's going, we have a wider challenge, we believe, and Transparency International is committed to trying to help with the challenges in terms of applying our expertise to contribute to the process of coming up with a very good climate governance system in the future. Thank you very much.
Lisa.